stay because they know that the cost of losing that user and reacquiring them is incredibly expensive, right? And the market is incredibly competitive. And so, GetJar, we had that as well, is that we were very, very focused on downloads initially, but we were not focused enough on making sure that the people that were using the service were being retained. And so the double problem that you get is you have users that are churning, and you have an increased cost of users for acquiring new users, which compounds the problem for most startups. So I would say retention is one of the big ones, at least.
Yeah, I would agree. Mature industries, retention, quality of users, so engagement, right, repeat usage, things of that nature are very important. I would like to, however, also point out that every few years, right, there's something big that happens in the ecosystem, right, and that's when you can't rely on metrics, right. They are going to fail you because they will show up too late, right. And I'll give you an example, right. We launched on Windows Mobile and Symbian, right. Fantastic success, right? There were some app stores like GetJar, but really people had to like SMS us a code, and we give them a link, and all sorts of crazy things to download. Great success. But we knew that those platforms were in trouble, right? And iPhone had launched, and Android was kind of okay. It was very geeky at that time, not mainstream, right? There was a huge debate whether we need to be to be a successful company, do we have to find a way to be on iOS and Android, where being a video streaming application and browser was not so straightforward, or is it BlackBerry, right? Because remember, there was BlackBerry then, right? And BlackBerry was not going to go anywhere, right? Because people like keyboards, and enterprise users want security, right? So there was this big debate, right? And we couldn't rely on metrics at that time because metrics would have failed us, right? Metrics just weren't pointing in the direction of Android being a success over BlackBerry, right? And that's where you have to also rely on intuition. I mean, the thing is, people here are founders, right? And I think founders need to have a right, or at least entrepreneurs, right? And have to have a right balance of metrics when they're reliable, and then just gut feel and intuition when metrics are going to fail you.
I mean, I don't agree with that. Metrics never fail. And I just think it's just what I feel, right? Like, if BlackBerry was gonna be succeeding, you would be seeing growth in BlackBerry. I mean, in my opinion. I mean, in MySpace, I wasn't seeing the growth, and I knew I had to do something, and we did it, but we just couldn't do it in time or whatever. It's just that your growth stops. It stagnates. You can't acquire users fast enough. Your engagement for the long-time acquired users, in that we call churn, it is higher than what you can acquire. You're not growing anymore, and it happens months after months after month, right? So, and if and the way and once you see that your growth is stagnating, you have to find other areas of growth, and that's what execution is all about. You just can't pivot fast enough. It's difficult to change company cultures when it's a little grown up and it's more mature markets. One thing, if you're a startup, like small startup, right? The barometer for success is not a lot of users. Barometer for success is highly engaged users, howsoever small they are. And at different phases, those barometers change. The metrics change, right? Once it's a mature company with millions of users, then it becomes arbitrage business, right? Like for us in the gaming industry, after 4 years, top crossing games and all that stuff, it was all around whales and revenue and arbitrage to lifetime value to the cost of acquisition, all that stuff. So it's all along the stages of where you are in the life cycle of your startup, right? And then you then you look for metrics at that stage as to what are relevant to it.
That's interesting that you say that, because about like success and failure and metrics, like. Most of the startups will certainly fail. So like if you think of like acquisition or getting a lot of users as success, then a lot of entrepreneurs will fail. So I think for me or my team, what we think about is like when we have an idea, we want to spend a certain number of months on it, and when we look back on it, like I guess the success will be when we can know. If we fail, this is why we failed. Like, I guess if we're not able to know whether it's the idea that failed or it's our execution, I think like if it's an idea that failed, and we execute it so beautifully, then I think that's a success for us. But if we are not able to know whether it's the idea or execution or the team, then I think that's like a biggest failure.
Can we actually talk about team failures? What have been, and you don't have to name names, but that asshole Paul. No. Any reports in the audience? No. Okay, so this is completely off the record. What kind of, give us hypothetical stories of personal failures that you have seen in other people, interpersonal failures in startups, or that you've had, but it's going to be like Bob and Jane had this problem, so you don't have to like talk trash about anyone. But I would love to actually hear about interpersonal failures, and I say that because we've actually worked with 36 startups as advisors over the last 3 years, and 30% of our companies have had founding teams break up. And what I've noticed is that when that happens, it tends to be kind of like a divorce. Like the founders are depressed, there's lawyers involved, it's a lot of money, it's really expensive, and like nothing gets done for a year. And so can you talk a bit about relationship failures a little bit?
I could talk about that one all day.
You don't have to.
So this session has been extended until today.
Yeah, let's talk about personal too.
Whiskey, more like. Yeah, I think I've seen it happen a lot the last 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years that I've been at this. I think one of the errors that I think is very common is when founders or CEOs are so successful so quickly that they start to believe their own bullshit. And it happens a lot, right? I mean, I think Uber is a great case in point these days. And who knows, it's too early to call whether they will succeed or fail, time will tell, right? But I've been in situations personally where we were so successful in several companies that I was in that we believed that we could do no wrong. We believed that the market was going to continue heading in the direction that it was going, and there was no reason to really look at alternatives. And the risk there is, particularly for CEOs, is that you stick to the same course too long, but also that the CEO or somebody on the management team who is responsible for executing the strategy and being operationally close to the consumer becomes so far removed from the consumer that they don't see how the consumer's habits are changing, or they don't see that the consumer is starting to use other products and services. And so that's kind of, I think, been one big thing. I think the other thing is kind of the dynamic of having a founding team that is able to challenge each other, but in a very constructive way and in a very humble way, but at the same time kind of just be in your face about things that they disagree with and have an open discussion without it turning violent, without it turning personal. And so, one of the reasons, for example, that I've been very excited about working with the team at Connect that I've been advising the last 3 months is I've rarely come across a startup team that is so harmonious, that works so well together, right? Where everybody knows exactly what they're trying to do, they all have the same vision, and there's a healthy debate about things where we disagree, right? So for me, the biggest failures with teams come from teams that, first of all, teams that haven't worked together. I started a company where, we got a whole bunch of TechCrunch hits and a bunch of stuff 7 months ago. 7 months later, I shut it down. And part of the reason I shut it down was I didn't feel that me and the founding team worked very well together. We all had different competencies that complemented each other, but we didn't gel well in terms of how we worked together. So biggest failures I've seen are, lack of humility, being a victim of your own success, and then kind of like having a team that does not kind of work in harmony, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate that I started this company, Skyfire, with someone I'd known for 8 years even prior, right? And we'd been to many battles and we had lots of battle scars. That wasn't our startup, we were early employees at a company. And so we just knew each other very, very well. And that always helps. That's obviously not a luxury everyone has. I would say that when we really started going from 6 people and like crazy hours and a putting range in the office, right, to kind of really trying to become a company, the 2 things we did was we really overemphasized the concepts of intellectual honesty and respect, right? Because it all comes down to that, right? If you're having an intellectually honest debate, as opposed to an emotional or sort of a religion-based debate, right? And with respect, right? Then you can really walk out of the room with some meaningful decisions being made, right? And so those are the, we had to pivot many, many times, like most startups have to, right? And so the two things we kept insisting as we grew the team, both the senior leadership team as well as the rest of the team, was intellectual honesty and respect.
It's a lot of blues, I guess. I mean, I really don't have much to add here. It's just that, I mean, it's incredibly important. You guys probably know all that stuff to have your co-founder, your first 5 team members be in sync with you and your vision or what are you going to achieve. I mean, it's you know, that's where the part of you have to establish a culture comes in. I mean, you know, and if you ask a lot of founders who have been through, and we say these things, and now I realize it because when I was starting out, I really had no idea what people are talking about when they kept saying about culture. But culture is essentially what you set, like it's your beliefs, right? And it's as a CEO, it's your job to set it out, you know. And I can't emphasize it enough. You have to over-communicate with your team, frankly. Right? You have to be selling that, you know. And you know, at the low points, which eventually will come, right? That's the time when your team gets tested, you know. So.
How do you actually get through the failures? What do you actually do aside from the bourbon?
I was going to say wild turkey.
Turkey, bourbon, scotch, single malt, wine.
Jack, okay.
You can call him John when you know Jack. What do you guys what other things have you guys actually done to kind of get over? You shut that company down, things really suck. How do you actually get back up and try again?
Like in my case, what we did was we just first be honest, and that's when your culture gets tested out in the company, and you stop. You know, if you're gonna run out, you stop taking salaries yourself. You know, kind of demonstrate you still believe and stuff like that. That's what I did, or at least my founding team did. You know, so that we could have the team in place rather than fire them and keep. You know, kind of we were around 12 people at that time, and you know, we were stagnating, we were going down. We stopped taking salaries so that my team could kind of keep having the jobs. That's how we demonstrated, kind of that we still believe and there's a way to pivot out of this.
We pivoted, so I talked about the TechCrunch story, but I think 3 months after that, we realized that so we were getting like 500,000 users, and at that time it was not the model that we're in, and we realized that wow, we're gonna burn out of money soon, and that's when we realized that we need to pivot. So I guess that was a failure, pivot one, and I think something that I learned about failure or pivot was that it's not it's not as bad as you think. It's not as bad as you fear, and I think it's mostly how there's success and there's failure, but what's really hard is everything in between. Your job is to get to either success or failure as quickly as possible, and to know whether you're in either direction. But when you're not knowing where you are in that timeline or direction, I think that's the biggest challenge.
I think the way I've seen people deal with failure really well, and the way I try and deal with failure is to be very, very open and honest about it with my co-founders. And I remember when we were raising money for my last company, we didn't go about the process very well. We really struggled, and the way we handled it best is just when we had these weekly meetings where we would talk about the issues, we would talk about what was happening, very, very transparently, and kind of to an extent celebrating your failures almost the way that you celebrate your successes. The teams that surround you, if you want to be an inspiring leader and you want to be an inspiring CEO, I think one of the number one things is you have to be transparent and honest with people. These are the people that come and work in startups. They need to have their eyes wide open. When we're hiring, for example, for engineering people now at Connect, I tell every single hire that we talk to, look, there is a 80–90% chance that this company is not going to make it in the next 3 years, right? That's just the reality of the startup world that you work in. And so I think, being open and honest with people, talking through why things didn't work out, talking through and whiteboarding how we could have done things better, and making sure that people completely acknowledge what happened and kind of like to an extent kind of celebrate and learn from that, it's like a cathartic process, right? Because everybody's got it on their chest. And a lot of people, they don't feel comfortable talking about it. Well, guess what? As the CEO and the founder, it's your role to be there and to put the issues out. Some people will not want to acknowledge that. And if you take that leadership position, you say, guys, we fucked up. This is, we did 1, 2, and 3. Okay, around the room, who else thinks that, we could have done better? How could we have done things better? Great, let's make sure we don't make that mistake again. I think everybody feels better about it in the extent that they know what happened and they know kind of hopefully how to avoid it in the future.
Yeah, I would say transparency. I think people hate bad news in a surprise way, right? There has to be a reason behind it. I think most people that work in startups are actually more mature than we think they are, right? And they can deal with bad news. And if you've made a few bad hires that can deal with bad news, well, this is a good time to kind of clean out house, right? They'll just leave. Something will happen, right? And you'll have more like-minded people. So in early 2008, we did our big Series B, right? $13 million. And 2 months later was the Sequoia sort of rest in peace startups, rest in peace good times thing, right? And we had a theory. We like, this is how we're going to get users. This is how we're going to put our monetization model in place. But then we had to actually stop and think that, well, there's a lot of unknowns, and we're not sure if monetization will really materialize or not, right? So we better change our hiring plan from this to really flat, right? Until we have certainty. When we didn't really fire half the team. We had a lot of money, but when we even just told people that we're changing this plan from this to this, it had to be reasoned out, right? It had to go along with the transparency that, listen, we still don't know how our monetization will work out, right? We couldn't tell them that everything's fine, everything's great, but by the way, hiring freeze, right? That doesn't compute, right? Smart people can't compute that, right? And they see through that bullshit, right? And so and there's been many more sort of difficult situations. This was not so bad. 30 million in the bank was not so bad. But every time we've communicated any kind of bad news, it's been with transparency, and that has, one, helped them understand the problems, two, actually help us solve as well, right? Some people come up with the good ideas then to kind of get you out of the mess.
So there's just one thing I would just add, especially if you're the founder CEOs here, you have to be transparent with the facts, but you have to be optimistic. You might internally you might be thinking you're fucked up and all that stuff, but you got to be really optimistic, man, out of the front. Never make that mistake of being, hey, I really don't know what to do. Don't, never, ever. I mean, and it's possible that you probably won't even think like that because you're a founder entrepreneur anyways, and you probably have that thing in your thing where I'm not going to fail kind of a thing, but you have to be transparent with the facts, but you have to be very optimistic.
That's where bourbon comes in.
And I would add that this is such a tricky thing, because if you are not optimistic, you're going to lose people, and if you're not transparent, you're certainly going to lose trust of the troops and lose people, right? And so you just have to find that balance between this eternal optimism and trust, right? Which, again, intellectual honesty and trust.
So I also I've been hearing kind of common threads of dealing with people's expectations and people dealing with people's anticipations. In a past life, I actually worked as an emergency room nurse, and I did a lot of work at pediatric emergency rooms. And I found that if a little child saw me in a stethoscope, and they could think that I was going to play with them, they would be happy. But if mom has been telling the kid, hey, behave, or that big guy's gonna come over here and stick a needle in you, I'll walk in the room and the kid screams bloody murder, and I might just be given the parents' discharge instructions, but it was the anticipation of something terrible that was just the worst thing possible for the kid. Is the anticipation or the fear of failure worse than the actual failure sometimes?
Depends on what failure you're talking about. Some failures are worse than the anticipated.
Okay, talk about both.
Okay, so again, if it's a failure because you thought this is a great product, great feature to launch, and you spent 2 months building it and it didn't do well, right? Then yeah, the anticipation of that failure was worse than the failure, right? That's okay. You tried something, and as long as you learned something from it, whoop-de-doo, right? Of course, if the company ran out of money, I'm not sure if that's the case then, right? And so I think just failures depends the magnitude of the failure, the criticality of the failure, right? In my opinion.
It's a tricky one, right? I think one of the things that's always talked about kind of in the venture world is kind of like knowing when to cut your losses, right? And I think that there's the delicate balancing act that you have as a startup CEO is kind of like trying to stick to your guns and stubbornly persevering when things get tough, but also knowing when things have been too tough and that you need to change direction, right? And so if you have that anticipation of failure and it's really gnawing at you, then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's kind of like what I've seen happen in companies is the management team and the CEO gets into this rut where things are just so hard, and the psychological perspective of the future is that things are going to get harder, and the optimism, to your point, is not there, that it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is why, the optimism has to be there, but it has to be managed, right? And you were talking about expectations. I think the other thing that I found with in startup world is that as optimistic as you want to be as the CEO, you always want to, if you have to confront people with a problem, you want to confront the people with the problem, but you also want to say, hey, here's the problem, but we have 1, 2, or 3 solutions, right? There's a problem, but there are solutions. And that said, you have to manage the expectations of people, right? You have to say, okay, here's the different options, the pros and cons, and there's a possibility that for whatever reason, these options may not work. And it's the same when you're hiring people and when you're promoting people. Like, for example, we just hired an amazing guy from Google, to come and join Connect, whose name I shall not say because he's still there and he hasn't told people he's leaving, or that I've poached him. With him, it's like very much about managing his expectations about how quickly his career is going to progress within Connect, right? Because it's a startup, things happen, things change. So, there's a lot of different things to keep in mind, but I think managing people's expectations, being transparent, and also kind of like level setting is critical. Right? You have to balance that optimism.
Well, when we did the pivot, I thought it was a failure, and so we were at 15 employees at that time, and it was like within 6 months of just starting the company. And so according to my anticipation of how this is going to turn out, it's going to be everybody would leave the company, and all the investors are going to be angry at me. How do I overcome this? And I think I was like overwhelmed by fear of failure. And then somebody told me that sometimes the biggest thing that you should be afraid of is being driven by fear, not by logic or by reasoning and your passion. So what ended up happening was we did lay off some people. We cut down half of our team, and now our team is 7 people, 6 engineers and myself. We're really lean, and when we build things, we build it so fast. So we lost some people. It was really hard, but it wasn't I guess when you have a lot at that moment, you feel like you have a lot to lose. But when you are at the brink of failure, you are not really so focused on that part. You're focused on getting to the next level. That it's not as bad as I thought initially.
I does not anticipate failure. I tell my team it's a marathon. If you're thinking you're going to launch something in a few months and it's going to be a success, that's not just going to happen. You look at metrics, but I don't anticipate failure. In a way, it's I don't think about it if this fails, what? Well, there's always a plan B and plan C. The idea's on the table, but I just don't anticipate.
Don't dwell on it.
I just dealt with it. Yeah.
A lot of what I'm hearing is that there aren't really a whole lot. You guys work fairly hard and are very good at managing the emotions around success and failure. Both don't let oh my god, this is awesome, get away from you. at the same time as like, oh my god, this is terrible. It sounds like you guys do a lot of work, not only with yourselves, but with your teams in terms of dampening those real high emotions of highs and lows.
You totally nailed it. That's when I, when I was, trying to talk about culture. I mean, that's exactly what it is. That, just educating or just kind of trying to tell your team about the vision and how it's a marathon, and it just takes, it's a process, right? And it is how it's done. It's, it's not like in an enterprise company or a vehicle or something where you know what the requirements are and you just work on it. It's just not the way it works in a startup. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that and sometimes most of the time the reality is that you're going to have to do both. Right? I think all of us can relate to that, right? That behind closed doors, right? Me and my founder, like just 5 people, fantastic potential hire. We lost them to this other stupid startup called Facebook as like the 8th engineer.
They're not going to go anywhere, man. Don't worry.
No, that's what I told him. What are you thinking?
They're not going to make any money.
Yeah, business model. Yeah, exactly. No business model, right? No. So behind closed doors, it was like, holy crap, right? How are we gonna now build all this database layer, right? But 5 minutes later, when we went out of the room, right, there had to be a plan, right? My co-founder, who's the CTO, is like, okay, fine. Now I'm gonna give this to you. I'm gonna take on the database layer. We have 2 more candidates in the pipeline. So it's not like, wow, awesome, we lost him, right? It can be that, but it's not. You go through some emotions that hopefully you have some people you can share it with, but then very quickly you come up with a plan that is a little more sort of dampened oscillation.
Yeah, I think that's very correct, and I think the other thing is, one of the things I've seen good companies do is really focus on building a very strong team company culture, right? And it goes back to, what makes and defines a startup is at the end of the day it's culture, right? And as a CEO and a founder, you're one of the big drivers of that culture. And so one of the things that I've found, in the companies that I've worked with or worked at that have been very successful, and obviously Google is a great example, it's a big company, is that they are able to hire people that fit within that culture. And so when you hire people that fit within the culture of the company that you're trying to build, you find that managing those expectations, the highs and the lows, is easier because you hired them for that reason, right? You hired them because they bought your vision. You hired them because they have certain values. You hired them because they fit culturally, right? So for example, at Connect, we make a big effort to hire people who are really, really smart, very, very, very good, very humble, but very focused on what they're doing, right? And so we don't hire people who are, loud mouth, arrogant, the people that, that we know are not going to gel with the rest of the company. And, I think that also makes it easier when you have to disseminate good news and bad news, right? But I think your point is a really good one, Jonathan, which is that, when whether it's celebrating successes or celebrating failures, you have to kind of keep an even keel. And, even when we had some of our biggest successes at, Getcher or Glue or some of the other places I've been, we were always saying, yes, we've had this awesome success and it's been a great win, but, let's stay focused on this. We still have to deal with this. We still have this other challenge. This is something that we have to deal with as well, which is difficult. So, it's great to kind of motivate and incentivize people and get them fired up about things, but also bring them back down to earth, right? So that when that bad news does come, you're always on this kind of like level setting.
How do you keep your teams, because I keep on hearing that this is going to be a long process. Like you guys started in 2007,
yeah.
And you've been at the companies for a number of years. I know it's been a little bit shorter for you. When did you actually start the company that recently exited?
2010.
2010. How do you actually motivate your team for a marathon? Because I'm hearing it's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be long term, and there's going to be highs and lows, and this is going to be awesome. Like I'm not as you can probably tell, I'm not necessarily an athlete. I don't really get excited about marathons, but how do you actually motivate people that this is going to be a long-term thing, but it's going to be awesome?
Celebrate small successes, one, right? Second, sell. As a culture, tell them how it is going to play it out. That is one of the #1 jobs of a CEO. Once you have a product market fit, before that you have a lean team, 3 or 4 guys probably, guys and girls, sorry, just trying to find some kind of product market fit or kind of pivoting or looking at the metrics. But beyond that, after that, it is trying to sell that thing and then celebrating those small milestones.
I guess I haven't thought about like motivating my team in the long term. I think first mistake I made when I just started out was I thought like when something goes down, I thought it was the end of the world, and I reacted to it. And like only after I think 10 times I realized, oh, it's a marathon. It's gonna happen, continue to happen. So first realizing that myself wasn't very important, because if I didn't realize that it's gonna continue to happen, then I would burn out my team. I would make every single mistake so important that everyone have to drop what they're doing and fix this. And like if you look at every company's like product roadmaps and bug lists, you're gonna continue to have infinite number of bugs. But as a first-time entrepreneur, I thought that like you need to be having a bug-free app, and any small things, like everybody has to like stay up all night to fix this. So